They sent people there and never spoke of them again. No records, no names, no graves, just silence. Somewhere out in the ocean, far from the maps that mattered, there existed an island that governments refused to acknowledge. Locals whispered about it in darkened rooms. Fishermen refused to sail within sight of its shores, and the few who ever dared to speak its name openly vanished into the same silence that swallowed everyone else. This was not a place of exile. This was a place of erasure. For generations, entire communities existed in enforced isolation on this forbidden stretch of land, stripped of identity, stripped of rights, stripped of the most basic human dignity. The world above the horizon moved forward. They did not. They could not. They were buried alive inside a system so ruthless, so deliberate, that even the act of remembering them became dangerous. You think you know the worst that history has done to people. You think you've heard the most unimaginable stories of what power does when left unchecked. You haven't, because nobody talks about this island. And when you find out why, you'll understand exactly why they buried it so deep. The island had a name once, a real one. It appeared on old colonial charts, marked with a small symbol that cartographers used for one specific purpose, places no ordinary person was ever meant to find. It sits, even now, surrounded by water so remote that supply ships came only 3 times a year. The landscape is brutal, volcanic rock, biting wind, and a sky that seems lower there than anywhere else on Earth, pressing down like a weight. Early settlers called it the place where God forgot to look. The authorities began using it in the late 19th century, not as a prison. That word carries legal weight, carries rights and documentation. No, they called it a settlement, a colony for the displaced, a solution. The people sent there were not criminals. They were the unwanted, the inconvenient. Entire families diagnosed with diseases that medical science barely understood, rounded up from towns and villages while their neighbors watched from behind closed curtains, loaded onto boats in the middle of the night. Their homes were locked behind them. Their names were removed from civil records before the ships even reached open water. We are talking about human beings, children among them, transported to a place deliberately chosen for its inaccessibility, chosen so no one would hear them, chosen so no one would come. The administrators who ran the island reported back to government officials with language so sterile it barely registered as human. Subjects are stable. Colony population has decreased. No further resources required this quarter. But here is the detail that will redefine everything you've just heard. The island was never once classified as a quarantine zone in any official government document, which means the isolation was never about containing disease at all. Let us be precise. Let us be unflinching, because the truth of this island deserves nothing less. The people sent here were suffering from leprosy, Hansen's disease, a bacterial infection that even in the 19th and early 20th century was vastly misunderstood, enormously stigmatized, and weaponized by governments across the world as justification for mass removal. In this colony, that removal became something far darker than exile. Families were separated upon arrival, husbands from wives, mothers from children, children from siblings. The rationale offered was disease prevention. The reality, buried in internal memos later uncovered by researchers, was something the authorities never wanted spoken aloud. They were conducting informal population control. They were not trying to treat these people. They were trying to make them disappear. And here is the jaw-dropping moment that redefines this entire story. Medical records recovered from the island's archive. Documents that were ordered to be destroyed, but were hidden instead by a single compassionate staff member, reveal that effective treatment for leprosy existed and was available from as early as the 1940s. The island continued operating for decades after a cure was accessible. The people imprisoned there were not kept in isolation because treatment was impossible. They were kept there because releasing them was inconvenient. Testimonies from survivors, the very few who lived long enough to speak, describe conditions that defy comprehension. Mud-floored dwellings, rotting food, no anesthesia during medical procedures, forced labor performed by people whose bodies were actively being destroyed by their illness, guards who wore 3 layers of protective clothing while residents had none. One woman, whose testimony was recorded only after she turned 84, said this: "She had arrived on the island at age 9. She did not leave until she was 61. And in all those decades, not a single government official ever visited to see what was being done in the name of public health. That is not a quarantine. That is a burial. A slow, terrifying, deliberate burial of people who were still breathing. The colony was officially closed, quietly, without ceremony, without announcement, in the latter half of the 20th century. No press release, no public inquiry, no acknowledgment of what had taken place there for nearly 100 years. The remaining survivors, elderly, broken, institutionalized after a lifetime of confinement, were released into a world that no longer knew them. Their homes were long gone. Their families were gone. Their identities had been erased from records before most of them were old enough to read. The officials responsible, retired, pensioned, in most documented cases, commended for their service. Justice, if it ever arrived at all, arrived late and insufficient. Some governments issued formal apologies, carefully worded, legally protective, emotionally hollow. Compensation schemes were established that paid out amounts so low they felt more like insult than acknowledgement. Survivors' advocacy groups fought for decades simply to have the island's history included in school curricula. In most countries where similar colonies existed, they are still not taught. And why does this matter today? Because the mechanisms that created this island, the willingness to designate a group of humans as unworthy of rights, the bureaucratic language that disguised cruelty as care, the institutional silence that prevented accountability, those mechanisms did not die with the colony. They evolved. We see them operating still in immigration systems, in healthcare policy, in the language governments use to discuss the vulnerable. The island still stands, largely empty now, the old structures crumbling into the volcanic rock. No memorial, no monument, no name on the maps that matter, just silence. Still, after all this time, here is what the island teaches us. Not about disease, not about medicine, about us. Every act of institutional cruelty in history required the same ingredient: ordinary people who chose silence over discomfort, neighbors who closed their curtains, officials who signed the papers without reading them too carefully, journalists who didn't chase the story, citizens who trusted that if something truly terrible were happening, surely someone else would stop it. The island was not built by monsters. It was maintained by indifference. And indifference, history shows us again and again, is far more dangerous than any individual act of cruelty, because it has no face to confront, no name to condemn, no moment of choice you can point to and say, there, that is where it went wrong. It went wrong everywhere, slowly, quietly, the way all the worst things do. We remember these stories not to feel horror and move on. We remember them because the question they leave behind is never really about the past. It's always about right now, about what we are choosing not to look at, about whose silence we're comfortable with, about which islands still exist, not on any map, but in the choices we collectively refuse to make. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the full weight of what history buries when we let it, tell us in the comments what you think should never be forgotten. And if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, subscribe, because more forgotten histories are waiting to be exposed.